They laughed at her boots. On the most important day of her life, whispers rolled through the crowd, mocking the bride who chose leather over lace, strength over delicacy. But when 3 armed men stormed her reception and terror silenced the hall, those same boots became the only thing standing between chaos and survival. What secret had she been carrying beneath her wedding gown? And how did a woman dismissed as unconventional turn into the protector of everyone in the room? This is the story no guest would ever forget, the bride who fought back. The morning of the wedding began the way so many others had before, its mirrors glowing with the heat of curling irons, the rustle of satin dresses being adjusted, voices overlapping in anxious whispers. The air inside the bridal suite was thick with perfume and the faint chemical bite of hairspray. Bridesmaids moved back and forth, their heels clattering against the tiled floor, arms full of bouquets and purses. They were focused on small details: the fall of a veil, the sharp crease of a ribbon, the way the light might catch a diamond just so. All of it was meant to form the picture of perfection. But in the corner of the room, the bride sat quietly, bent slightly forward, her hands steady as they pulled at worn leather laces. She was not adjusting slippers of silk or shoes lined in lace. She was tying boots, sturdy, scuffed in places, the leather softened by years of use. Their weight was different from what the others expected. Their sound, when set against the floor, was heavier, surer. The bridesmaids exchanged glances at first, subtle and cautious. They smiled tightly, then turned away, whispering in lowered tones that still carried in the small room. "Boots under white lace," absurd one said. "Disgraceful," another muttered. A wedding was for fragile things, for beauty that floated, not for souls that carried mud and memory. The bride heard them, of course. She always did. But she said nothing. She only tugged the laces tighter, tucking the knot flat against the tongue so it would not show beneath the hem. She smoothed the fabric of her gown down over her knees, letting the ivory silk spill around the boots like water trying to hide stone. For a moment, she looked at her reflection in the tall mirror near the window. From the waist up, she was every bit the bride they expected, veil pinned perfectly, eyes shimmering with carefully brushed makeup, hands resting on satin folds. But beneath, she knew, was something different. The door to the suite opened then, and an aunt leaned inside, breathless with excitement. "It's time," she whispered, and her eyes fell briefly to the boots before darting back up again. Her smile faltered for half a second. She did not comment. But the judgment lingered in the silence she left behind as the door clicked shut. When the bride stood, the gown billowed gracefully, the lace sweeping low enough to hide what she wore beneath. For a moment, it seemed no one would notice. She could walk, she could stand, and the boots would remain her secret. But secrets rarely last in rooms filled with eyes hungry for flaws. As she moved toward the door, the hem lifted slightly, caught by the motion of her step. A bridesmaid gasped, hand half raised as if to shield the sight. The boots flashed once, undeniable. A ripple passed through the room. Laughter, faint but sharp, slipped from lips painted in perfect gloss. "Boots," someone whispered, almost in awe, though the tone carried mockery more than admiration. The word hung in the air like a verdict. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. Her hand rested on the doorframe as she paused, steadying her breath. If they thought it odd, if they thought it foolish, let them. The boots had carried her through nights colder than this, through mornings harder than any vow. She wore them not for fashion, not for rebellion, but because they were hers, trusted, worn, familiar in a way no glittering heel could ever be. Down the hallway, the music had begun. A violin's notes floated faintly, a prelude to her walk. She stepped forward, the boots muffled under the sweep of her dress, their sound lost beneath the anticipation of the gathered crowd. Yet she felt their weight with every step, grounding her at the far end of the aisle. Beyond flowers and candles, her groom waited. His eyes met hers as the doors opened, and in that single glance was something no whisper could diminish. He noticed, of course, he always noticed, but there was no laughter in his look, no mockery, only recognition, quiet and unspoken. He knew what they meant. He knew why she wore them. The crowd rose, chairs scraping softly against polished wood. The veil caught the light, the lace shimmered in the air, and the boots pressed steadily against the ground. Whispers rustled in the pews, rolled eyes darted between relatives. Quiet laughter stirred like wind at the edge of a storm, but she kept walking, each step as measured as a vow. The boots beneath the dress had already become the story of the day. What no one yet knew was how quickly that story would change. The laughter did not stop when she reached the altar. It softened. into whispers, traded like currency between rows of relatives, who leaned toward one another with raised brows and hidden smirks. The bride's boots, glimpsed only briefly, had become the secret everyone thought they shared alone. Some stifled chuckles behind folded programs. Others shook their heads in disbelief, as though what they had seen were too ridiculous to accept. A wedding, they said with narrowed eyes, was meant for beauty heels that clicked softly across marble, shoes that slipped daintily beneath satin. Boots belonged elsewhere, in dirt and rain, in barns and backyards. But not here. And yet here she stood, tall in her gown, the veil trailing down her shoulders. Her face was calm, her breath steady, her hands folded tightly around her bouquet. If she heard the laughter, she gave no sign. If she felt the eyes cutting toward her feet, she did not lower her gaze. She kept her chin lifted, eyes fixed on the man she had chosen. The man waiting with hands clasped, eyes steady. The minister began to speak. Words practiced and ceremonial, a rhythm designed to comfort. They spoke of love, of unity, of promises, made before God and family. But beneath those words lingered the soft shuffle of dresses, the muted coughs that disguised whispers. Even as vows were exchanged, the boots remained in the minds of the guests and uninvited guests themselves. Worn leather hiding beneath silk dot, she remembered, even as she stood there, the day she had chosen them. The clerk in the shop had looked at her strangely when she asked to see the boots in her size, his hands hesitating as if he had misheard. She tried them on anyway, lacing them carefully, pressing her heel against the sole to test its give. They had felt solid, firm beneath. Her shoes she could trust, not fragile, not decorative, real. She had bought them without hesitation, though she knew they would invite questions. And questions had come. Her mother had pressed her lips tight when she first saw them, eyes darting between the boots and the gown still wrapped in its plastic cover. "You can't wear those," she had said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Not on your wedding day." But the bride had only smiled faintly, setting the boots by the door as if the decision required no defense. Now, standing at the altar, she thought of that moment for disapproval, the silence that followed. It was the same silence that pressed against her now, disguised as whispers and faint laughs. They didn't understand. They never had. When the minister asked if she took this man, her voice carried steady. "I do," she said, the words unshaken. Her groom repeated his vow, his eyes never leaving hers. He did not look at her feet, did not flinch when the lace of her gown lifted briefly as she shifted her weight. His hands trembled only when they touched hers, a tremble not of fear but of awe, of something larger than the mockery behind them. Rings slipped onto fingers, lips brushed in a kiss. Applause filled the hall. For a moment, the boots disappeared into the swell of clapping hands and cheering voices. But as the couple turned to walk down the aisle together, the hem of her gown shifted once more. The boots appeared, and the whispers returned. Guests smiled politely at the newlyweds, while exchanging sly looks, unable to let go of the image that had unsettled them so much. She did not look at them. She walked forward, step after step, the boots grounding her against the polished floor. Outside, beyond the chapel doors, the air was crisp with early evening. She breathed it in deeply, the scent of cut grass and blooming flowers sharper than any perfume inside. For the first time that day, she let her shoulders loosen. They would not understand, she thought, not yet. To them, the boots were a joke, a stain on tradition. But to her, they were something else entirely. A memory, a promise, a shield she carried when no one expected it. They mocked what they did not know. And in mocking, they revealed only their blindness. She stepped into the evening light, her hand wrapped in her groom's. Behind her, the whispers continued. Ahead of her, silence waited. The boots pressed into gravel with quiet certainty. They still didn't understand. But one day, they would. The reception hall glowed with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light across polished floors and linen tables. Waiters drifted through the crowd carrying trays of champagne, the clinking of glasses blending with soft laughter and the hum of a string quartet in the corner. Guests gathered in small clusters, voices overlapping as they retold familiar stories, exchanged gossip, and made the kind of observations that carried sharpness wrapped in politeness. Yet beneath the polite surface of it all, one detail lingered in their conversations: the boots. It began quietly, as most things do. A pair of cousins near the buffet leaned close, their words hushed. "Did you see? Real boots. Under that gown." They laughed into their glasses, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Not far away, an older aunt pursed her lips, shaking her head as though the sight had been too disgraceful to put into words. She whispered to the woman beside her, "It's unbecoming. A bride is meant to look graceful, not sturdy." The other nodded, her earrings swaying. Her agreement silent but visible. The whispers spread like threads pulling through fabric, weaving from one table to another. Young women smirked, adjusting their delicate shoes, as if to remind themselves they had chosen correctly. Men chuckled under their breath, glancing toward the dance floor, where the bride stood with her new husband. Phones slid discreetly from pockets, the glow of screens catching her in half-hidden photographs. In those pictures, the boots peeked from beneath lace like a secret exposed. Captions were already forming in their minds, jokes to be shared later, proof of a memory too strange to forget. The bride felt their eyes. She always had. Though she smiled when approached, though she thanked each guest for their congratulations, she could sense the current beneath the words. Compliments arrived, laced with hesitation, sentences that began warmly but ended with glances downward, toward the hem of her dress, even as her groom kept her close, his hands steady at her back. The murmurs pressed against her ears, like insects buzzing to near Dot at the head table. She sat with posture perfect, her bouquet resting gently across her lap. She lifted her glass when the toasts began, listening as relatives stumbled through memories and jokes. Laughter rose in waves, and for brief moments she allowed herself to forget. But each time her gown shifted, each time her foot moved against the polished floor, she saw the ripple of awareness. The whispers were never gone, only waiting. Her grandmother sat near the front, eyes sharper than most, lips pressed into a thin line. She said nothing aloud, but her gaze followed the boots with every glimpse. For her, tradition was not suggestion but law. She had married in a gown so heavy it bruised her shoulders, in shoes so narrow they cut her feet. That was the way. It was done, and to stray from it was defiance. The boots to her were not just footwear. They were rebellion wrapped in white silk. The bride lowered her eyes to her plate, her fork tracing idle patterns across the food she hardly touched. Around her, the guests continued their quiet chorus, some pitying, some amused, all certain they understood better than she what a bride should be. They whispered as though their words dissolved into the air, unseen, unheard. But she heard them. Every syllable reached her, and though her face remained calm, though her hands stayed steady, something inside her tightened. When the music swelled and the first dance began, she rose. Her gown swept outward as she moved to the floor, her groom's hand clasping hers. Together they stepped into the center as cameras lifted, phones poised to capture what should have been a flawless moment. Yet when she twirled, when the lace spun outward in graceful arcs, the boots emerged again. Gasps slipped into the air, quickly replaced by laughter muffled behind hands. The music continued, but the whispers grew sharper, carried now in tones too bold to be mistaken for anything else. They don't match. She looks ridiculous. What was she thinking? The bride kept moving, her body swaying with the rhythm, her gaze fixed on the man who held her. His eyes did not waver, his smile did not falter. For him, there was no absurdity, no shame, only the truth of her presence, steady and unshaken. But beyond their circle, the crowd kept murmuring, each word another stone placed upon the weight. She carried Dot, and still she danced. Dot, every step pressed the boots firmly against the floor, a reminder with each movement that she belonged in them. The whispers could not undo that truth. They could not know the miles those boots had walked, the storms they had endured, the nights when silence and strength were all she had. They mocked what they did not understand, and in their laughter, they revealed their blindness. The music ended. Applause filled the hall, but beneath the clapping hands and smiling faces, the whispers still stirred, as steady and relentless as breath. The bride lifted her chin. She would let them whisper. The boots would speak louder soon enough. The laughter that followed their first dance carried on longer than it should have. It hung above the tables, seeping into the corners of the reception hall like smoke that refused to clear. Guests sipped from their glasses with smirks hidden in the rims, their eyes glancing back again and again to the hem of her dress. The boots had become the evening's quiet entertainment. They had turned the bride herself into an object of curiosity, a story to retell later when the music and food were forgotten. Yet beside her stood her groom. His hand did not leave hers, even when relatives tried to pull him into small circles of conversation, into jokes about tradition and appearances. He stayed anchored at her side, his presence a steady barrier against the voices that pressed too close. He did not scold the whispers, nor did he rise to defend her with words. Instead, he watched, he listened. And when she caught his gaze, he gave her a nod so slight, so steady, it seemed to steady her in turn. That nod was not for the guests. It was not for display, not a performance for the cameras lifted discreetly in the crowd. It was only for her. In it was everything unspoken between them, that he saw her, that he understood, that the boots were not an accident but a choice, and that he trusted the reasons she carried inside them. She remembered the first time she had told him about them. It had been years earlier, long before vows and rings, when their lives had still been uncertain. They were walking through the back fields near her family's farm, the air damp with the scent of rain. She had worn the same boots then, laces tightened, leather streaked with mud. He had laughed lightly at first, teasing her for preferring them over shoes that might have seemed more fitting, but when he saw her expression serious, unyielding, he had quieted. She had told him then, in fragments, what they meant, what they had carried her through. Nights of exhaustion, mornings when giving up had seemed easier, times when strength came only in silence. He had not pressed for more. He had only nodded then too, the same nod he gave her now across the crowded reception hall. It was his way of saying he knew enough, that he did not need to demand every detail to understand. Some things were carried, not spoken. As the speeches began, his family rose to toast. Their words warm but careful, skirting around the detail everyone else could not leave alone. The boots went unmentioned, yet the glances remained. The bride's fingers tightened faintly around her glass, the crystal trembling against her hand. She smiled when expected, lifted her drink when prompted. But the whispers reached her all the same. When it was his turn to speak, the groom did not launch into jokes or polished stories. His voice was calm, his sentences short, as though he spoke only to her, though the microphone carried his words across the hall. Today, he said, is not about appearances. It is about the choice we made to stand here together. That is all that matters to me. There was applause, polite, scattered. Some smiled, others rolled their eyes. But when he turned to her, his eyes did not leave hers. And again, he nodded small, sure, a gesture no one else would think twice about. To her, it was everything. The evening moved forward, food carried out, music rising again, children slipping between tables in laughter. Yet for all the noise, the nod lingered in her. It steadied her breathing, softened the tension in her shoulders, while the crowd saw only boots beneath lace. He saw the woman who wore them. Later, when they sat together at the head table, he leaned close, his words barely above a whisper. Don't mind them, he said. I know why. He didn't need to explain further. She lowered her eyes briefly, a faint smile breaking through the stillness of her face. The guests would go on whispering through the night, repeating their small jokes, capturing their hidden pictures. But between bride and groom, there was no joke, no shame. There was only understanding. And in the quiet nods he gave her, when the laughter rose loudest, she found the strength to keep her silence. The reception hall dimmed as the band struck its opening notes. Lights softened into a golden hue, chandeliers flickering gently, as if they too had been asked to lower their voices. A hush fell over the tables. Forks set down. Conversations paused. All eyes shifted toward the center of the polished floor, cleared now for the bride and groom's first dance. The bride stepped forward, the hem of her gown brushing lightly across the ground. Her groom followed, taking her hand with practiced ease. For a moment, the air held reverence, the kind reserved for milestones, for beginnings sealed with ritual. But the reverence did not last long. The song was slow, tender, its melody wrapping around them as they swayed together in rhythm. Her gown billowed with each turn, its lace catching the light like snow beneath glass. The veil trailed behind her, an echo of movement. It should have been perfect, the kind of moment guests photographed to hold on their mantles, framed as proof of beauty. But then the skirt lifted, just slightly, just enough for leather to flash beneath silk. Boots, heavy and certain, pressing into the polished floor where dainty shoes were expected. It was an accident of movement, but once revealed, it could not be unseen. The ripple began. Near the front tables, a quick intake of breath, a stifled laugh, the kind of sound that tries to disguise itself as a cough. Then whispers. There they are again, one guest muttered, eyes narrowing. Unbelievable, another said, shaking her head while pretending to adjust her napkin. Phones rose discreetly once more, screens glowing in the half-light. Angles were chosen carefully, skirts captured mid-swing, boots immortalized beneath lace. The bride felt the change in the room. She always did. The music was steady, her groom's hand warm against hers, but the laughter pressed against her ears all the same. It was not loud, not cruel enough to break the dance, but sharp in its restraint, sharper in its secrecy. Laughter that hides itself is always the kind that cuts deepest. Her groom's eyes never left her face. He spun her gently, pulling her close again, his smile unwavering. She searched his expression for a flicker of embarrassment, for the smallest trace of hesitation, but found none. Only steadiness. Only the same quiet nods he had always given when others questioned what he already understood. Around them, however, the whispers grew. Why would she ruin the moment? Someone murmured near the bar. It's her wedding. For heaven's sake. Couldn't she just wear proper shoes for one day? The words slipped easily between sips of champagne, but their sting traveled further than they imagined. As the song carried them across the floor, the bride let her thoughts drift, if only for a moment, away from the crowd. She remembered the weight of the boots in the box they had come in, the way she had kept them by the door for years, ready for mornings when the ground was still wet with dew. She remembered the ache in her legs after long marches, the silence, a field stretching beneath a gray sky, the discipline of moving forward even when her body begged her to stop. The boots had not been chosen for beauty. They had been chosen for survival, for strength, for memory. Another turn, another ripple of lace, another round of laughter, too quiet, too silent but too loud to ignore. The bride's breath caught, her steps faltering only for a second. The groom's hand tightened, pulling her closer, steadying her. His lips brushed her ear in a whisper no one else could hear. Keep going, he said softly. It's only us. She exhaled slowly, her body falling back into rhythm with his clip. The laughter was still there, but it no longer drove her steps. Each movement pressed the boots firmly into the floor, a quiet defiance, a silent vow. The guests could laugh, they could whisper, they could snap pictures that would circle later with mocking captions. But the boots remained. They belonged. The song ended, the final note lingering in the air like smoke. The hall erupted into applause, loud and polite, though threaded still with laughter hidden behind hands. The bride and groom bowed their heads briefly, then stepped back toward their table. Her gown swept outward one last time, revealing the boots to the crowd once more. The applause faltered just slightly, the laughter rising again in its place. She felt it all, but she did not lower her head. She walked steadily, her boots pressing against the polished floor. Every step a reminder that she carried more than they would ever understand. What they mocked tonight would one day silence them. The laughter followed her even after the dance ended, trailing like smoke that clung to fabric long after the fire had gone out. She sat beside her husband at the head table, smiling where politeness required, lifting her glass when toasts rose in her honor. But behind each speech, behind each well-wishing phrase, she heard its stealthy murmurs that circled back to her. Boots. A cousin leaned across the table, hand half covering her mouth, whispering a joke that made her companion snicker into his drink. An uncle shook his head with the weary disbelief of a man who thought traditions were being lost. Even those who said nothing at all carried it in their eyes, that small flicker of judgment that betrayed them. They saw boots, but they did not see what lived inside them. The leather was not new. It had softened where the creases met her ankles, darkened where laces had been pulled too tight too many times. Scars marked their surface, scratches from gravel, stains from mud, faint burns from nights too close to fire. She had carried them through storms that split the sky open, through fields where silence was survival, through hallways where the weight of every step meant readiness. Each line across the leather was not carelessness, but history, a record of places she had walked when others stayed home. Her guests could not imagine it. They pictured boots as barn shoes, as working gear, as something that belonged in mud or on factory floors. They could not picture them in barracks, lined neatly at the base of metal bunks. They could not picture them soaked with rain after 12 hours of drills, each drop turning the ground beneath her into a sucking weight that tried to pull her under. They could not picture them kicking against doors in places she had never told her family about, or planted firmly, while her hands moved quickly, precisely, with skills learned through long repetition. The boots were not decoration. They were memory woven into leather and lace. They were the one thing she trusted when everything else faltered. And when she had chosen them for this day, it had not been a mistake, not rebellion, but instinct. The same instinct that had kept her alive, the same instinct that had taught her to plant her feet, breathe steady, and wait for the right moment to move. Her husband knew. That was enough. He never mocked, never questioned. He had seen her polish the boots until her fingers ached, had watched her set them by the door each night, as though their placement mattered, as though they needed to be ready for something unseen. He knew they were more than footwear. They were part of her, but the guests could not know. And so they laughed. The bride lowered her eyes to her plate as another toast rose, the words blurred by the weight of memory, her fork pressed into food she had no appetite for, her fingers restless against the tablecloth. She wanted, for a brief moment, to lift the hem of her gown fully, to show them all the scars on the boots, to ask if their delicate shoes had ever carried them through nights that demanded silence, through mornings that left muscles trembling. But she stayed still. Explaining would mean nothing to those who believed weddings were stages and brides were ornaments. Instead, she let them whisper, let them smirk, let them think her choice was foolish. Because she knew what they did not. That the boots were not weakness, but armor. And that armor had a way of revealing itself only when the moment demanded it. She lifted her glass once more, her hands steady now, her eyes sweeping across the crowd that judged her. They did not know the stories she carried in leather and scars. They did not know how quickly laughter can vanish when history steps forward. The boots were waiting. And so was she. The hall had been chosen months in advance, booked with care, and decorated with precision. Its ceilings arched high above the guests, beams of polished wood meeting chandeliers that dripped crystal light. Along the walls hung garlands of white flowers, their petals pale against dark panels, arranged so neatly they seemed painted rather than real. Round tables filled the space, dressed in ivory cloth and crowned with candles that flickered low. Silverware gleamed under the light. Glasses chimed faintly each time someone raised a toast. And the air carried the faint scent of roses, mixed with the heavier aroma of roasted meat carried out from the kitchen. It was the kind of room designed to hold memories, photographs, laughter, polite speeches. A room where people expected perfection, where each detail was meant to soften the eye and please the ear. On the surface, it was flawless. But beneath the glow of the chandeliers, the atmosphere felt strained. The boots had already become the unspoken centerpiece, eclipsing the food, the flowers, even the music. Though the hall brimmed with voices, much of it circled back to her. Aunts who had traveled hours leaned close to one another, speaking with the sharp certainty of those who believed their opinions were owed. Young men clinked glasses together, their smirks quick and careless, their whispers carrying even when they thought themselves discreet. Children pointed, asking questions too loudly, their mothers shushing them with nervous glances. The bride had become both spectacle and subject, and the reception hall, meant for joy, now carried an undercurrent of mockery. She felt it most when she tried to move through the room. Each step she took, gown trailing behind her, was met with a brief pause of conversations, the flicker of eyes shifting downward, the faint curl of lips pressed against wineglasses, her boots pressed into the polished floor with certainty. But the whispers followed closely, chasing her no matter how far she moved. Her groom walked beside her, his arm brushing against hers. He smiled at guests, accepted congratulations, shook hands with relatives he hardly knew. But his hand, when it touched her back, was firm, grounding her. He felt the weight in the room as much as she did. His eyes, each time they met hers, carried the same quiet nod as before, a reminder that they were together in this, that the noise of the hall could not touch the vow they had already made. Still, they're not here for the food, she murmured, her lips barely moving. Watch their hands. He frowned, his brow tightening, but said nothing more. He trusted her tone more than her words. She had never spoken like this without reason. At one of the tables, a child dropped a fork, the clatter ringing against the floor. The sound made the nearest stranger shift, his head snapping toward it too quickly, his shoulders tightening before he caught himself. The child's mother bent down, laughing quietly, lifting the fork as though nothing had happened. Around her, the guests continued eating, continued chatting, but the bride saw it. That tiny crack in composure, the way the man's body betrayed his alertness, his readiness to act. Another sign followed soon after. The three began to spread apart, moving casually, but with purpose, each drifting toward different corners of the hall. They walked as though looking for empty chairs, nodding briefly at passing guests. But their formation spoke louder than any excuse. They wanted distance between them, coverage, control of space. The bride's hand tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. She forced her face into calm, her smile faint but convincing. If anyone glanced at her now, they would see only a bride listening politely to her cousin's story, her attention fixed where it should be. But inside, her pulse had shifted into rhythm, beating steady with the awareness of what was coming. The laughter around her continued, unaware. Plates clinked, glasses rose, children darted across the floor. The hall was still a wedding, in the eyes of most, but for her, it had changed. The boots beneath her gown pressed firmer, her body adjusting subtly, instinctively, ready for weight to shift, for silence to shatter. She did not know when. She did not know how. But she knew what others could not yet see. The signs had begun. And when the moment came, she would be the first to move. The first few minutes after the strangers, spread apart, felt strangely unchanged. The band played on, soft notes from the string quartet weaving gently through the air. Guests laughed at familiar stories, leaning across tables with glasses in hand. Plates clinked as servers replaced empty dishes with new ones. From the surface, nothing had shifted. The reception was still a wedding, still a celebration, and yet, underneath, a different current began to flow. It started with silence, in pockets small, brief pauses that only sharpened the noise around them. At one table near the far wall, a guest noticed the way one of the men lingered close to the exit, his shoulders squared, his gaze sweeping too often. She leaned closer to her husband, whispering, "Do you know him?" The husband shrugged, but his eyes followed longer than they should have. Their conversation faltered, voices dipping into unease. At another table, a group of young cousins had been laughing loudly, snapping pictures of themselves with cake crumbs on their plates. But their laughter dimmed when one of the strangers passed by, his steps measured, his expression hard. They lowered their phones slowly, their jokes trailing into half-hearted murmurs. The room did not freeze all at once. It tightened gradually, like fabric pulled thread by thread. The bride saw it happening, eyes darting more quickly now, smiles flickering shorter, shoulders shifting as though to make room for something unwelcome. A single drop of suspicion was all it took to poison the comfort of a crowd. She kept her gaze steady, her hands folded loosely in her lap. From where she sat at the head table, she could see the pattern clearly. The strangers had placed themselves with precision, one near the exit, another closer to the bar, the third drifting toward the dance floor. Their spacing cut the hall into corners, their bodies forming quiet boundaries the guests did not yet realize had been drawn. The music, so carefully chosen, suddenly seemed fragile. Notes that once lifted the room now fell thin against the walls, drowned by a silence too heavy. The violinist's bow trembled slightly when his eyes caught the figure near the bar, though his hand continued playing by habit. Even the waiters, moving briskly with trays of champagne, slowed when they stepped too near the men. They did not linger. They did not ask questions. They slipped away with their trays heavier than before. The bride lowered her eyes briefly, focusing on the feel of the boots against the polished floor. Their weight steadied her, pulling her back into the discipline she knew well. Watch, breathe, wait. She was trained to see the freeze in a room, to recognize when ordinary chatter had shifted into something sharper, more brittle. This was not panic yet. Panic was loud, chaotic, uncontrollable. This was its beginning, the fragile pause before the break. The silence that warned of a fracture. Her groom leaned close, his voice low. "They've noticed," he murmured, glancing at the nearest guests, who now whispered nervously. She gave a slight nod, her eyes still scanning the men. "Not enough yet, but it's coming." Another small shift rippled across the hall. A child, restless and bored, darted across the dance floor with a toy in hand. He collided lightly with the stranger, standing near the bar. The man's body stiffened instantly, his hand pressing briefly against his jacket, as though guarding something inside. The child blinked up at him, startled, before his mother rushed over, apologizing quickly. The stranger said nothing. He only stepped back, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning once again. The mother led her son away quickly, her face pale. She did not return to her seat immediately. She lingered near the edge of the room, her gaze flicking between the three men, her unease now plain. Others noticed her expression, and soon their own eyes turned more carefully, more searching. The laughter that had once filled the hall now felt strained, forced, as though each chuckle carried the weight of doubt. The bride felt her pulse settle into rhythm, calm but sharp. This was the moment before unraveling, the breath a room holds before someone breaks it open. The boots beneath her gown dug in firmly. She knew the freeze would not last. The strangers had not come to stand silently forever. The room was waiting, suspended on the edge of something it did not yet understand, and she was waiting too, ready for the silence to shatter. The quartet played on, but their song had thinned into something hollow. Fingers still moved across strings, bows still drew across notes, Yet the melody no longer filled the room, it skimmed the surface, ignored by ears now tuned to something else. Guests shifted in their seats, their laughter faltering, their words dropping shorter. The hum of celebration had grown brittle, and even those who tried to hold onto it could not shake the unease that crept through the hall. It happened suddenly, though not without warning. One of the strangers, the tallest of the three, stepped toward the center of the room. His shoulders squared, his movements no longer disguised as casual. A murmur spread in his wake, the kind of murmur that grows when people sense something, without fully knowing it. The bride's eyes locked on him, her breath steady, her boots pressed harder against the floor, every muscle in her legs waiting. Then came the break. The man reached inside his jacket and pulled out the shape everyone had tried not to imagine. A gun, black, small in the hand, but heavy in meaning. Its appearance stopped everything. The bow of the violin slipped across strings, producing a sharp, broken note that cut the air in two. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Children's laughter, stilled mid-breath. Forks clattered faintly against plates as hands let go. The music ended not with a final chord, but with silence that fell like a curtain. The hall froze, just as the bride had known it would. The stranger's voice rose, sharp and commanding, though he spoke only a few words. "Stay where you are." He did not shout, but the authority in his tone carried louder than any scream could. His companions moved quickly now, each drawing their weapons in unison. The one near the bar turned, sweeping his eyes across the tables, his weapons steady. The one by the exit locked the doors behind him with a swift motion. The metallic click, echoing through the stunned quiet. Guests gasped, some clutching hands to mouths, others reaching instinctively for those beside them. A child whimpered, the sound breaking into the silence before being hushed quickly by a trembling mother. The chandeliers above seemed suddenly too bright, their glitter mocking the fear below. Candles flickered harder, as if the air itself recoiled. The bride did not flinch. Her gaze stayed sharp, her breathing slow. Around her, panic pressed against the edges of the room, but she had been in rooms like this before. She had seen what happened when fear spread too quickly, when movement broke order. The key was silence. For now, her groom's hand brushed against hers under the table, a fleeting touch, not of fear, but of trust. He knew the stillness in her face, the weight in her body. He had seen it before, though never here, never in a wedding hall filled with flowers and family. The strangers scanned the crowd, their weapons a language sharper than words. Guests obeyed instinctively, bodies stiffening, eyes wide, breaths shallow. The laughter that had mocked the boots only minutes earlier was gone, now, replaced by silence too deep to bear. The bride let her eyes pass quickly from one man to the other, memorizing their positions, their spacing, their grip on the weapons. Her body adjusted unconsciously, shifting her weight lower into her boots, preparing without visible motion. This was not yet the moment to act, but the moment to know. And she knew. The music had stopped. The laughter had died. The hall was no longer a place of celebration, but of survival. And while the guests sat frozen, staring at danger with wide, helpless eyes, the bride's silence was different. Hers was the silence of readiness, steady and unbroken. Because unlike the rest, she had worn boots for a reason. The room held its breath. The strangers, armed and unblinking, now controlled the hall, with the weight of silence, more than the weight of their weapons. Guests sat stiff in their chairs, eyes wide, hands frozen mid. The chandeliers glimmered, as though mocking the fear below, scattering light across faces that had lost all trace of celebration. The bride did not sit as the others did. Her posture was calm, upright, her chin steady above the lace of her gown. Beneath the table, her boots pressed firmly into the polished floor. The leather creaked faintly as she shifted her weight, a sound no one else heard, but one that told her body what it needed to know. She was grounded, ready. The tallest man in the center scanned the crowd, his weapon steady, his jaw clenched. With authority. "No one moves," he repeated, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hall. His two companions mirrored him, each claiming a portion of the room with their stance. One near the bar, gun angled toward a cluster of guests too frightened to breathe. One at the doors, his body blocking any thought of escape. Guests obeyed, their stillness thick with fear. But the bride's stillness was not theirs. Hers was different. Theirs was helplessness. Hers was calculation. Her eyes moved quickly, noting the space between tables, the distance to the men, the angle of their hands. She counted seconds between their glances, measured the time each took to sweep the room. She did not think of chandeliers, of flowers, of whispers that had mocked her boots only an hour before. She thought of patterns, of movement, of rhythm. The same things she had been taught to see when noise and chaos demanded clarity. Her groom, seated beside her, looked at her face, then at her hands. He saw no tremor there, no panic. He had seen her in storms before, though never like this, never with weapons drawn around them. He leaned closer, his voice a thread only she could hear. "Not yet," he whispered, as if reminding her. She didn't answer. Her silence was enough. She was not reckless. She was not impatient. But she knew what others did not. When a room like this froze, it only stayed frozen for so long. Eventually, someone panicked. A child cried too loudly. A guest tried to be brave, and in that moment, violence erupted. To wait forever was to invite it. To move first was to control it. The boots beneath her gown had been built for motion. They had carried her through mud and rain, through places where hesitation was a mistake one never survived. Tonight they would do the same. Her chance came sooner than most would have expected. A waiter, pale and trembling, slipped at the edge of the bar, the tray in his hands tilting as glasses toppled and shattered against the floor. The sound was sharp, echoing through the silence like a gunshot. One of the armed men spun, his focus breaking from the crowd, his eyes snapping toward the noise. His grip on the weapon shifted slightly. Attention pulled in a single direction. It was enough. The bride's breath stilled, her muscles tightening, her boots pressing harder into the polished wood. She slid her chair back with deliberate control, the sound faint but sharp against the silence. Guests nearest her turned their heads in alarm, whispering frantic pleas for her to stay still, to obey, but she ignored them, her eyes fixed on the men, her body moving with a steadiness no wedding guest had ever imagined. The tallest man caught the motion too late. By the time his eyes snapped back to the head table, the bride was already on her feet, her gown sweeping outward, her boots revealed in full for the first time. The whispers that had mocked them hours earlier vanished in gasps of disbelief. The boots had moved first, and the room, once frozen, began to change. The scrape of her chair against the polished floor rang louder than it should have. Heads turned, eyes widened. Guests who had spent the evening mocking her boots now stared at them in shock as she rose from her seat, the hem of her gown sweeping outward to reveal the dark leather in full. For a brief second, the room did not know whether to gasp or to plead with her to sit back down. The tallest stranger, standing near the center, swung his weapon toward her, his voice sharp. "Sit down." The words cut through the silence like glass breaking. His two companions froze as well, their eyes snapping toward her. The hall seemed to shrink in that instant, every beam of chandelier light narrowing on her, as though the world itself had chosen her as its center dot. But the bride did not obey. Her boots pressed firmly into the floor, her body lowering just slightly, her weight distributed in ways only training had taught her. The gown swayed around her legs, its lace brushing against leather, and for a moment she looked like nothing more than a defiant bride, refusing humiliation. Yet beneath that lace, every muscle in her body was poised for precision. Her eyes flicked quickly across the three men. The one near the bar had his weapon angled downward, distracted still by the crash of glasses. The one at the door was holding his position, but not yet focused. The one in the center, he was the leader. His jaw set, his weapon steady, his voice carrying command. He would be the first. The room held still, every guest frozen in the tension between fear and disbelief. Someone whimpered near the back. A chair creaked as a hand gripped it too tightly. A child began to cry before being hushed with desperate whispers. The strangers fed on that fear, on the silence that followed, but the bride did not. She had lived in silence before she knew how to bend it. Her groom's hand brushed against the edge of her gown, as though reaching for her, as though to hold her back. But he stopped. He saw the set of her shoulders, the calm in her breath. He knew what that meant. He had seen it once before, in a story he never repeated but never forgot. He let his hand fall, his eyes steady on hers. A silent trust passed between them. The leader barked again, "Sit down now," or his voice faltered. Not in weakness, but in surprise. For in that moment, the bride moved. It was not a frantic rush, not a desperate lunge. It was clean, sharp, controlled. Her boots slammed against the floor as she lunged forward, her body sweeping in a motion hidden partly by the veil of her gown. The movement shocked the crowd, their gasps erupting louder than the music ever had. She closed the distance with speed no one expected, one hand snapping up to the barrel of his weapon, the other striking hard at his wrist. The gun discharged, the sound deafening in the enclosed hall. A flash of light burst near the ceiling as the bullet struck harmlessly into plaster. Screams erupted. Guests ducked under tables, glasses shattered, chairs tipped. The chandeliers trembled overhead as though shaken by the force. But the bride did not flinch. She twisted, her boots planting firmly as she ripped the weapon from his hand, her elbow striking into his chest. He stumbled backward, his breath leaving him in a sharp grunt as his body slammed against a nearby table, scattering plates and candles. The other two men raised their weapons, but the hall was no longer theirs. Panic surged in the crowd, scattering in every direction, and in that chaos the bride moved again, her boots carrying her swiftly toward the second man before his aim steadied. Gasps turned to shouts, fear turned to disbelief. The bride, mocked for her choice of boots, was now the only one standing firm in a hall that had collapsed into chaos, and for the first time that night, the strangers realized the room was no longer theirs to control. The gunshot had ripped the silence apart, and with it, the fragile order of the wedding hall shattered. What had once been laughter and clinking glasses turned instantly to screams. Guests stumbled from their chairs, plates crashing to the floor, glasses spilling wine across the ivory cloths. The chandeliers above still glimmered brightly, as if mocking the panic below, casting fractured light over a room that no longer belonged to celebration. The bride did not falter. Her boots slammed against the polished wood as she pivoted, the weapon she had torn free from the leader's hand clattering across the floor, kicked away deliberately so he could not reclaim it. He groaned where he had fallen, clutching at his chest, but she did not linger on him. Her eyes had already shifted to the second man. He was raising his weapon, his jaw clenched, his body steady, despite the chaos swirling around him. The guests between them screamed, ducking under tables, one woman covering her child's face with both hands. The bride surged forward, her gown billowing out, lace sweeping across the floor like smoke trailing her steps. The boots beneath carried her low, steady, her weight driving each stride with precision. The second man fired, but the shot went wide, tearing into a wall as a cluster of guests ducked just in time. The chandelier above trembled again, a crystal piece snapping free and shattering. On the floor, gasps filled the room, the sound nearly drowned by the ringing in everyone's ears. The bride closed the gap before he could fire again. Her hand struck his wrist, her boot driving into his shin with a force that made him stumble. His weapon clattered, bouncing across the tiles where a terrified guest kicked it away with frantic instinct. Screams turned into shouts now, people crying out for help, for order, for answers. The reception was chaos, guests crawling under tables, waiters spilling trays in their rush to flee, chairs overturning as bodies scrambled for cover. But within the storm, the bride's movements remained clean, focused, each motion precise, not wild. The third man, stationed at the door, snarled and lifted his weapon high. He fired into the ceiling, the plaster raining dust down onto the crowd. "Enough," he shouted, his voice hoarse but commanding. The sound froze some of the guests in place, their cries falling silent, their bodies trembling as though his voice alone could pin them where they stood. He aimed the weapon toward the bride now, his teeth clenched in fury. She turned slowly, her chest rising and falling, her eyes locking on his. Around her, the hall was madness, flowers crushed underfoot, candles extinguished by overturned cloth, children wailing against their mother's shoulders. The air was thick with fear. Yet she stood steady in the middle of it all, her gown torn at the hem, her boots dark against the floor. For a moment, the hall seemed split in two, the strangers and their weapons on one side, the bride standing alone on the other. But it was not truly so. The guests, terrified though they were, had seen her strike. They had seen her disarm one man, drive another back. Whispers ran through them even as they crouched low, whispers of disbelief, of awe. Bride lifted her chin, her boots shifting subtly as she prepared to move again. The third man steadied his weapon, his breath sharp, his aim locked. The chandeliers swayed slightly above, as if waiting. The hall was chaos. But in the chaos, something new had begun, an order that belonged not to fear, but to her. And in that moment, a silence pressed briefly into the madness. The crowd began to realize what the strangers had not. The bride was not the one cornered here. They were Dot. The stranger at the door held his weapon steady, his finger tight against the trigger. His voice thundered again. "Everyone down. Nobody moves." The words cracked across the hall like a whip, but they no longer carried the same weight as before. Fear still lingered, yes, but it was fraying at the edges, unraveling thread by thread. Because in the middle of the room, where lace and leather met polished wood, the bride still stood. She had not crouched. She had not hidden beneath a tablecloth or pressed her body against the floor like the others. She remained upright, her boots square beneath her gown, her chin raised, her gaze fixed. And the guests, scattered across the wreckage of their celebration, saw her clearly now, not as a figure of ridicule, not as a bride mocked for breaking tradition, but as the only one in the room who had not bent beneath the weight of fear. Whispers spread first. A cousin crouched near the bar, her trembling hand still gripping her husband's sleeve. She disarmed him, she whispered, her eyes wide, her voice sharp with awe. Her husband only nodded, his jaw clenched, his gaze locked on the bride, as though seeing her for the first time. Another guest, older, his glasses askew from ducking under a table, muttered, "She's trained. Look at the way she moves. That's not chance." The whispers grew, weaving through the chaos like a thread. Guests who had laughed at the boots only hours earlier now found themselves staring at them with new eyes. Those boots had carried her across the room, had given her the balance to strip weapons from men twice her size. They were no longer the object of ridicule. They were the anchor of survival. The stranger at the door noticed the shift. His jaw tightened as his weapon swept across the crowd, his voice louder now, more desperate. "Do not move," he barked, the edge of panic bleeding into the command. But panic never inspires obedience for long. The guests saw him for what he was. One man holding a weapon. Yes, but one man who had already been shaken by the bride's defiance. The bride did not speak. She let the silence work for her. Let her stillness remind the room that not all control belonged to the intruders. Her boots shifted subtly, planting deeper against the floor. Her body lowered just slightly, her gown brushing outward, the signal of someone preparing to strike again. Even without words, her stance said what the crowd needed to hear. This is not over. The groom rose beside her now, not with her sharp precision, but with steady resolve. He did not reach for her arm, did not try to pull her back. He stood because she had stood, and his presence calm, quiet, loyal sent its own message. If the bride was not afraid, neither was he. The crowd absorbed it. Fear remained, thick and heavy, but it no longer paralyzed. A guest near the center reached for his child, pulling her closer but no longer crouching low. Another, closer to the back, sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing on the men who had ruined a wedding. The ripple spread slowly, but undeniably, shift from cowering to watching, from helpless to waiting. The intruders felt it too. The leader groaned where he had fallen, his hand clutching his chest as he glared at the bride with something sharper than pain, something closer to fear. The one near the bar glanced at his companion by the door, the flicker of doubt clear in his eyes. They had expected obedience. They had expected control. They had not expected resistance. The chandeliers above swayed faintly, their crystals catching fractured light as though reflecting the fracture in the room itself. The hall was no longer theirs. Not fully. The crowd's silence had changed shape. No longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of waiting for the next strike, for the next movement, for the bride to lead again. The stranger at the door adjusted his grip, his voice breaking into the tension once more. "I said stay down," but the command rang weaker now, swallowed by the weight of 100 eyes no longer bowing beneath it. The bride's boots shifted again, the faint creak of leather sounding like thunder to those who watched. She did not need to speak. The crowd had already turned, and in that turn lay the beginning of their defiance. The hall seemed suspended in the thin air between silence and eruption. Every guest's breath had slowed, their eyes fixed on the bride standing tall in the wreckage of her reception. The three armed men had begun with dominance, but now the balance wavered, shifting inch by inch toward the woman in white who refused to bend. The man at the door barked his order again, voice cracking with anger. "Stay down." His weapon swept the room, but his eyes betrayed him, darting too often to the bride, unsettled by the calm she wore like armor. His authority was breaking, and everyone in the hall could feel it. The bride's chest rose once in a steady breath. She felt the leather of her boots press against the polished floor, solid and sure. Beneath the torn lace of her gown, her stance was low, balanced. She had counted the seconds between the men's movements, memorized the spacing between them, and tracked every shift of their eyes. The time to wait had passed. Now was the time to act. Her hand moved first, swift and decisive. From the table she seized a heavy candlestick, its silver gleam catching the fractured chandelier light. To the guests it seemed sudden, a blur of lace and steel, But to her it was the inevitable rhythm of training motion. Smooth, precise. With a quick pivot of her boots, she hurled it across the hall. It struck the man near the bar before he could lift his weapon. The impact cracked against his temple, the sound sharp as breaking glass. He staggered, his gun clattering across the floor, his body collapsing into the overturned chairs behind him. Gasps filled the air, not of fear this time, but of stunned disbelief. The crowd had just watched their bride drop a man with the same ease she had once lifted her bouquet. The leader, still on the ground from her earlier strike, cursed and tried to push himself upright. The man at the door snapped his weapon back toward her, fury twisting his face. Enough, he roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. But she was already moving. Her boots slammed against the floor as she surged forward, her gown sweeping around her like a storm. She closed the distance faster than his aim could settle. With one hand she shoved Thebril upward, the shot firing harmlessly into the ceiling. With the other, she drove her knee into his chest, the force sending him staggering back against the door. His breath escaped in a strangled grunt. His weapon jarred loose from his grip. She caught it before it fell, the weight solid in her hands. The hole erupted not in screams this time, but in cries of astonishment. Guests who had cowered beneath tables now lifted their heads, eyes wide with something closer to hope than terror. Children clung tighter to their parents, but their parents no longer trembled as before. The tide was turning before their eyes. The bride stood in the center of it all, her gown torn, her boots planted firmly, the weapon now hers. She did not point it wildly. She held it low, steady, her breath calm. Her silence was sharper than any command, and it carried across the hall. Everyone could see it, the shift, the control, the certainty. The last armed man, the leader who had once commanded with ease, now looked on her with disbelief. He had come expecting compliance, expecting fear. Instead, he found himself staring at a bride who had dismantled his men, stripped him of authority, and held the room in the palm of her hand. The chandelier swayed faintly above, crystals scattering light across her face. The guests' whispers grew louder now, no longer mocking but awed. "She's protecting us." She stopped them. "Look at her, she's not afraid." The counter had begun, and the hall, once gripped by terror, now leaned toward her, waiting for the next move. The hall smelled of smoke from the plaster dust, shaken loose by stray bullets. Broken glass glittered across the floor like frost beneath the chandeliers. The guests remained crouched low, yet their eyes tracked only one figure now. The bride, boots planted firm beneath her torn gown, a weapon gripped steady in her hands. The leader, the last of the three, stood unsteadily. His chest heaved from the strike she had delivered earlier, his jaw set tight with fury and disbelief. He had seen partners disarmed, one crumpled against the bar, another pinned against the door. The plan, whatever it had been, was unraveling before him. Yet pride, that dangerous anchor, kept him upright. His eyes burned on her, not with the detached calculation of before, but with a personal rage. "You think you can stop me?" he spat, voice cracking with venom. He staggered toward her, every step unsteady, but filled with menace. His weapon was gone, but his fists clenched like iron, his shoulders squared in defiance. His body coiled to strike, not with bullets, but with brute force. The bride did not back away. Her gown swayed as she stepped forward, boots scuffing lightly against shattered glass. The pistol she had wrested free remained steady at her side, lowered but ready. Yet her eyes told the truth. She had no intention of firing, unless left no choice. She preferred her strength, her precision. The discipline etched into her muscles long before this day. The guests whispered in the shadows. "She'd kill him." "No. Look at her, she's waiting." Fear and awe blended in their voices. The room charged with expectation. The leader lunged. His body cut through the broken chairs and spilled wine, his fists swinging for her throat. She moved like water around him, her boots sliding across the polished floor, her gown twisting with the motion. His swing met air. Her counter was swift, her elbow driving hard into his ribs. He grunted, folding slightly, but still came on. With another blow, they circled in the wreckage, predator and prey, though the roles were no longer clear. He struck with raw aggression. She answered with precision. A block, a twist, a strike. Every move she made was low and sure, her balance grounded in leather that had never once betrayed her. The crowd watched breathlessly, every thud of boot or fist echoing louder than the music ever had. At last, she seized the moment. As he swung wide, clumsy now from exhaustion and pain, she stepped in close. Her hand snapped to his shoulder. Her boot swept his leg, and in one fluid motion she brought him crashing down onto the table behind her. Plates shattered under his weight, candles toppled, wax spilling across cloth. He lay there, gasping, his rage broken into ragged breaths, his strength scattered across the floor with the glass and silverware. The bride stood over him, chest heaving, face steady. The pistol remained in her hand, but she did not lift it. She did not need to. He looked up at her, eyes no longer filled with fury, but with the dawning awareness of defeat. The room was silent again, but not with fear. The guests had risen slightly, now, their gazes fixed on her not as an oddity or embarrassment, but as the figure who had saved them. The boots they had mocked were the boots that had broken the leader. The bride lowered her weapon fully, letting it hang at her side. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but firm, carrying across the ruined hall. "It's over." And for the first time since the strangers had entered, the crowd believed it. For a long moment, no one moved. The hall seemed caught in a pause between past and present, between chaos and recovery. The bride stood over the fallen leader, her pistol lowered, her breath steady though her gown clung to her in tatters. The guests watched, every face still pale with shock, every body still bent in postures of fear. It was a child who broke the spell. A small girl, no more than 7, peered from beneath a tablecloth where her mother had hidden her. She saw the bride's boots planted firmly against the floor, the lace torn but the figure above unshaken. Her small voice carried across the silence. She stopped them. The words were soft, but they struck harder than the gunshots had. Heads turned toward the child, then back to the bride. Murmurs began, uncertain at first, then stronger as courage found footing. "She's still standing. She took them down. She saved us." The whispers spread like fire through dry grass, fueling something the intruders had meant to smother. Guests began to lift themselves from the floor, brushing glass from their sleeves, straightening jackets, smoothing dresses. Their eyes were still wide, still cautious, but no longer filled with the helplessness that had frozen them minutes before. The groom rose beside her fully now, no longer half hidden by the head table. He placed his hand on her shoulder, not to steady her. She needed no such thing but to show the others what he already knew, that the center of the hall was no longer the intruder's domain. It belonged to his wife. One by one, the guests began to stand. A cousin helped her elderly father to his feet. A waiter, trembling, picked up a tray from the wreckage and set it aside neatly, as though reclaiming his place in the order of things. Even those closest to the fallen leader, who had shrunk back moments earlier, now stepped cautiously forward, forming a loose circle around the bride. The room's silence shifted again, no longer tense, but charged with something different. The boots that had once been ridiculed for their plainness, for their lack of delicate beauty, were now the symbol of the strength that had carried them all through. Every guest saw it. Every guest knew it, even if none dared to say the words aloud just yet. The leader groaned from where he lay sprawled on the table, his breath ragged. His eyes darted to the guests around him, and for the first time his gaze faltered. He had entered the hall, expecting fear, obedience, silence. What he saw now was a crowd slowly reclaiming itself, not with shouts or vengeance, but with the simple act of standing upright again. That quiet defiance was worse than chains. The bride looked around her, her eyes sweeping the circle of faces. She saw family who had mocked her choice, friends who had laughed behind their hands, strangers who had dismissed her boots as unbecoming. None of it mattered now. They stood, and they stood because she had. Her voice came low, firm, carrying across the room without force. "It's safe now." The words rippled outward, settling into shoulders, straightening spines. A few guests even dared to move closer, whispering encouragement to one another, as though reminding themselves that they were more than the fear that had bound them. Minutes earlier, the chandeliers above still swayed faintly from the earlier gunfire, scattering fractured light across the faces below. The music had stopped. The tables were ruined, the floor littered with glass and plaster. Yet the hall no longer felt broken. It felt reclaimed. The guests who had once mocked now looked at her with awe, and as they stood again, their posture carried something unspoken, gratitude, and perhaps even shame, because they knew the truth now. They had seen who had protected them, and they knew it had been the bride in boots. The hall, once roaring with music and laughter, now sat in a hush, so complete it felt unnatural. The chandeliers above still cast their fractured light, but their sparkle had lost its warmth. Tables lay in disarray, candles toppled, glasses shattered, plates smeared with forgotten food. The 3 intruders were down, one groaning against the bar. another pinned near the door by the weight of his own defeat, and the leader sprawled across a wrecked table. Yet no one cheered, no one clapped. The silence that followed victory was not triumph, but something heavier. The bride stood at the center, her gown torn, her boots firm on the ruined floor. She still held the pistol she had taken, though its barrel pointed downward, the weight of it steady in her hand. Around her, the guests stood slowly, their movements careful, as though any sudden sound might bring the chaos rushing back. Her groom remained beside her, his hand brushing her shoulder once more, but he said nothing. He knew, as she did, that words were too fragile now. The silence carried more weight than speech. Some of the guests began tending to one another. A waiter knelt to help an older woman gather herself after stumbling. A cousin pressed a napkin to a small cut on his wife's arm. A child clung to her mother's dress, eyes wide, whispering questions her mother could not answer. Each motion was quiet, subdued, carrying the tremor of people relearning how to move after fear had held them still for too long. The bride's eyes drifted to the fallen men. The leader shifted, groaning faintly, his face pale with defeat. His eyes darted once toward her boots, then away, as though ashamed to acknowledge what had bested him. The others stayed where they were, subdued, their weapons scattered beyond reach. They were still dangerous, perhaps, but their power had cracked. The hall no longer belonged to them. The bride let the silence stretch, her breath steady. She did not lower her guard, but she did not move forward either. The moment demanded stillness, the kind of stillness that marked a difference between chaos and order. She had learned long ago that after the clash came the silence. And in that silence, one decided what came next. Guests began to whisper again, but the whispers were different now. Not the mocking laughter of earlier, not the shrill panic of minutes before, but soft, reverent tones. She stopped them. She saved us her boots. They carried her through it. The words drifted like prayers, hushed but undeniable. Each one carried a weight that pressed harder than applause could have. Her groom finally spoke, his voice low, almost private, though it carried in the quiet hall. You don't have to stand alone anymore. They've seen. She did not answer. Right away, her eyes swept across the room, past faces that now held awe, where once they had held judgment. She saw her relatives, the ones who had rolled their eyes earlier at her choice of footwear, now standing straighter in her presence. She saw her friends, who had whispered and smirked, now silent, humbled, and she saw strangers. Two people who had come to celebrate but had been caught in fear, looking at her with the kind of recognition that could not be taken back. The silence held, but it had changed. It was no longer the silence of terror. It was the silence of aftermath, of understanding. The bride lifted her chin slightly, her boots pressing once more into the glass-strewn floor. She did not need to explain herself. The room had already seen the truth, that she had been mocked for her choice, dismissed for her difference. Yet when danger arrived, it was those very choices that had saved them all. And so, in the silence, after victory, nothing more needed to be said. The weight of silence lingered heavy in the reception hall, broken only by the faint groans of the disarmed intruders. The bride remained at the center, lace torn, boots steady, the pistol still lowered. In her hand, the guests, scattered and shaken, stood in a fragile circle of recovery. Their faces pale but their posture straighter than before. It was the sirens that broke through first. Faint at the start, their rise distant and uncertain, they grew louder, sharper, until their wail pressed against the windows of the hall. Heads turned, whispers spread across the room. Not of fear this time, but of anticipation. Help was near. Blue and red lights spilled across the walls as vehicles skidded to a stop outside. Tires screeched against pavement. Orders barked through. Radios carried faintly through the closed doors. The guests moved closer together, instinctively drawing into a huddled mass around the bride, as though her presence remained their anchor, even with help outside. The heavy knock came a moment later, rattling the door that had been barred. Police, open up. The command rang clear, filling the space with authority none could question. The bride shifted her boots across the floor, stepping toward the door. The pistol she had taken remained in her grip, but her fingers stayed off the trigger. Her movements measured. She kicked the weapon of the man nearest her across the room to keep it far from reach. The leader sprawled across the broken table, groaned faintly, but made no attempt to rise. His eyes burned with humiliation, not power. Her groom stepped forward, reaching for the bolt. His hands, steady, despite the chaos behind them, slid it free. The door groaned open under his push. Floodlights and flashlights pierced the dim reception hall as uniformed officers swept in. weapons raised, eyes scanning every corner. They moved in sharp precision. Their boots crunched over broken glass, their commands slicing through the air. Hands where we can see them. Everyone stay calm. Step away from the suspects. The guests obeyed instantly, their arms rising, their voices falling into hushed compliance. But the officer's eyes quickly locked onto the scene. 3 intruders on the ground, their weapons scattered far, and at the center of it all, a bride in torn lace, leather boots beneath, holding a pistol at her side. For a moment, the officers hesitated. Confusion flickered across their faces. It did not fit the reports they had been given: panic-armed men, hostages. Yet here stood a woman steady as stone, the air around her charged not with chaos but with control. One officer stepped forward, his voice steady but respectful. "Ma'am, set the weapon down." The bride's gaze held his calm and unwavering. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the pistol onto a nearby table. The clang of metal against wood echoed across the hall. She raised her hands then, not out of fear, but because it was what the moment required. Her eyes remained steady, her boots pressing firmly into the floor. The officers moved quickly, cuffing the intruders, reading rights, hauling bodies upright. The leader snarled once, but his voice was thin, his strength broken. The guests watched silently as order was restored, uniforms replacing fear. An officer approached the bride again, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "They said you disarmed them." His tone carried disbelief, though his gaze carried respect. The bride did not answer. Her silence said enough. Around her, the guests' whispers rose once more, no longer mocking, no longer fearful. They spoke the truth plainly, to each other, to the officers, to anyone who would listen. "She saved us. She stood first." Those boots carried her through it. The authorities had arrived, but it was already clear the hall had been saved long before the sirens. The flashing lights outside had begun to fade, their glow retreating as the last of the patrol cars pulled away. Inside the reception hall, officers still lingered, filing reports, photographing evidence, escorting the intruders out, one by one. The guests, though shaken, had begun to reclaim themselves, seated now, at half-cleared tables, whispering softly, clutching hands. Their laughter gone, but their voices returning in fragments. And at the center of it all, the bride remained. Her gown was torn, streaked with dust and wine. Strands of hair had fallen loose from the veil, clinging damp against her face. Her boots, dark and scuffed, gleamed faintly under the fractured chandelier light, their leather carrying the marks of her struggle. She looked nothing like the bride they had gathered to celebrate that morning, polished, radiant, delicate, and yet, she looked more herself than ever. The guests stared at her openly now, their whispers no longer mocking, but reverent. They had ridiculed those boots, laughed at her choice, rolled their eyes at her defiance of tradition. Yet when the moment had come when danger had ripped through the heart of their celebration, it had been those boots that steadied her, those boots that carried her through. The groom moved closer, his arm sliding quietly around her waist. He did not speak. Words would have been too small, but his touch was steady, his presence a promise that needed no explanation. He had seen her before the others did. He had known there was strength beneath the lace, precision beneath the silence. Now the room knew it too. One officer approached, his notebook in hand, his pen scratching quietly as he asked questions. "You acted quickly. Where did you learn to do that?" His tone carried genuine curiosity, not accusation. The bride met his eyes. For a moment, she considered answering, but she let the silence linger instead. Some truths did not need explaining. Some belonged only to the weight of memory, to the boots that had carried her through long before this day. She let the officer wait, then finally replied softly, "You learn what you need to survive." He nodded, accepting it, and moved on. Around her, the reception hall began to stir with new life. A cousin righted an overturned chair. A waiter carefully gathered broken plates. Someone lit a candle again, its flame flickering stubbornly against the gloom. Slowly, the room that had been broken began to piece itself back together, though it would never be as it was. The bride looked down at her boots, streaked now with plaster dust and spilled wine, and allowed herself the faintest of smiles. She had chosen them because they were steady, because they were hers. Others had not understood. They had wanted delicacy, tradition, beauty bound to expectation. But when the music stopped, and the silence turned to terror, delicacy had not saved them. Boots had. The whispers continued, weaving through the hall in quiet awe. "She saved us. I'll never forget it." The bride in boots. The words carried forward, not as gossip this time, but as memory. Later, when the tables were cleared and the hall emptied, the story would remain. Guests would tell it to others, their voices hushed and reverent. How the bride had stood firm when no one else could. How her boots had been mocked until they became the mark of survival. The details would blur with time, the chandeliers, the shattered glasses, the way the music had stopped. But the image would endure. A bride in white lace, standing tall in leather boots, steady against the chaos. And as she stepped forward, leaving the wreckage behind with her groom at her side, she knew one truth above all. Her wedding would not be remembered for the flowers or the vows, not for the songs or the feast. It would be remembered for the moment the bride in boots disarmed 3 armed men and saved them all.